Welcome, creative adventurers. I'm Debbie Cohn with Cone Designs. I'm so glad you stopped by today. It's the final week of our summer Scrappy Sizzler Quilt Along. I hope you've been sewing along with me. I'm really excited to bring you the final quilt in the multicolor colorway. In today's video, we're going to go through the finishing and the layout and the final reveal of the quilt. I'm going to cover squaring up the blocks, the sashing posts and borders, and lots of tips and tricks along the way to make your final quilt a success. And on the makeshift design wall behind me, I have the multicolor version of the quilt. In a couple of weeks, I will show you the blue and white colorway as well. I'll pop up a zoomed out photo of the finished quilt top for you to look at as well. Before we get into the details, just a couple of notes. One, if you have not already downloaded the patterns for the blocks, the fabric requirements, and this final pattern which shows you the layout and the finishing, you'll want to do that right away. Please download everything from my website in the free pattern section by August 31st, 2022. After that, I will be taking those individual pieces down from the website and I'll be consolidating them into one complete pattern that will be for sale on my website. If you've missed any of the previous 4 weeks of the quilt along, I'll have that playlist for you as a link at the end of the video and also in the video description box below. Before we get started, one other note. I know that some of you won't need all the details on the layout and the finishing, so I put in the video description timestamps of the various sections for the details. In case you want to refer to them, you can scoot right on to that section of the video or watch the whole video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and tell a friend. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already. That's the best way you can support my channel and my business. Let's get started. Just a couple of thoughts about sewing this quilt. I used jeans fabric for the sashing and the borders. There's a couple things you'll want to know. One is that it frays very easily. You'll have lots of strings. You'll just have to put up with it and trim them as you go. Two, you're going to want to use a little bit heavier needle, at least a size 14 or even a 16 needle, because you'll be sewing through 1 or 2 layers of denim at any one time. The third tip I'd like to give you is to be sure to clean your machine and your bobbin case thoroughly after every bobbin of thread. In this week's video, we'll be putting it all together. I'll be showing you how to square up a block, how to add block sashing and row sashing and sashing posts, and then how to sew it into rows, add your borders, and the final layout. First, let's look at the blocks. Here's our stack of block number 1, the 16 patch. You should have 18 of them. You can see mine here. 18 16 patch blocks. That's block number 1. Next, I have this in 2 piles. This is block number 2. You should have 3 of each block. Block number 2, it's this one. Block number 3, this one, 3 of them. Block number 4, which is flying geese, that's this one. You'll notice on my flying geese, I did them 2 different ways. One, I had it where the background was in the center. Another one where I had the background on the outside. And another one where I had the background with a fairly large background print, so it kind of mixed and matched. Also, you'll want to note that the flying geese are going in opposite directions. Half of the block they go this way, half of the block they go this way. That's block number 4. The next blocks are block 5, which is an X shape. You can see that. There's 3 of them. This is what I like to call a bullseye shape here. This is block 6. And last but not least, this is block 7. It is the inverse or the reverse of block 1. You'll have 3 of each of the 6 designs for the half square triangles, for a total of 18 half square triangle blocks, along with the 18 16 patch blocks. Before we can put it all together, we'll need to square up the blocks. I'm going to show you 2 different ways to square up those blocks. One is to use a ruler and your mat, and the other is to use a square 8.5 by 8.5 inch ruler, which I happen to have. First, let me show you how to square up your block using a ruler and a rotary cutter on your mat. In this case, I'm using my 2.5 by 18 inch ruler because that makes it quick and easy. Before you begin squaring up your blocks, take a look at them. If there are a couple of blocks that you know are smaller than the others because you had cutting errors or sewing errors, you want to make a decision. Do you want to cut all the blocks down to the smaller size of the smallest blocks, or do you want to remake those 1 or 2 blocks, if it's only a couple of blocks, so that they fit the rest of the blocks? It's your call what you'd like to do. If you've made a cutting error on many of the blocks, then you'll want to just square up all the blocks to the smaller unit size. For this pattern, it will not matter because the sashing will be between the blocks and between the rows, so they won't meet up. As long as all of the blocks are the same size in this quilt, then you'll be fine. In my case, though, my blocks were pretty accurate, give or take 1/8 of an inch or so. So let's look at this as an example. So here's a 16 patch. I'm going to line it up on my mat at a line on the mat. In this case, it's the 7-inch line. And I'm going to look over to the 8.5 inches to 8.5 inches over. The blocks will square up to 8.5 by 8.5 according to the pattern. So I'm looking along here and I can see that the edges are just a tiny bit over, so that's good news. It's not smaller. Looking at the bottom, I can see just a little bobble right there was just not quite 8.5, but enough that I can catch it in the seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is, because it's over on this side but not this, I'm going to scoot it over just ever so slightly so that I split the difference. There's a tiny bit over on this side and a tiny bit on this side, so that I don't end up cutting off too much of one side of the block, and that makes my squares look lopsided. So I've scooted it over just enough to split the difference, and I'm going to begin trimming. I'm going to lay my ruler down at the 8.5 inch mark, have a firm grip on it, and ever so slight amount I'm going to trim. I'm going to flip it around, and this time I'm going to line up the cut edge right at the exact mark, so at the 7-inch line here, going over to the 8.5 inches, and I'm going to use my ruler to cut that extra little bit. And you can see there's just a tiny bit. I'm merely just straightening up the edge. There we go. Now we're going to do the other 2 sides. I flip it around. I do the same thing. I look to see first how over or under it might be. In this case, they're looking pretty close. So I'm making sure that my seams are lined up. I'm going to cut here on this edge to trim it. There's just barely any that needs trimming. Pressing firmly and flip it around and trim the other side. Again, there's just slivers. If you have a tiny bobble, as you'll notice right there, just a tiny bit, a 1/16 of an inch, it'll be fine. That will be caught in the seam allowance, and I'll know, because when I'm lining it up, that I need to take this little bobble into account. Okay, that's how you trim with a ruler and a mat. Now let me show you how to trim using a square ruler. In this case, I happen to have a Fiskars 8.5 by 8.5 inch ruler. You can get them in many different brands. This makes it a little bit faster. You don't have to line it up every time. You just lay it on there. What I do is I center the ruler over the block, trying to make sure that if there's excess, it's equal amount of excess on all 4 sides. And I also try to line up my lines, like this line right here matches the seam line in this block, and again going this way, trying to match the center line of the block with this line here. The goal here is to make sure that when you trim it, you trim the same amount on all 4 sides. So now I take my rotary cutter and I'm going to trim down one side, across the top, holding firmly, because turn the whole block around, and trim the other 2 sides. If you have a rotating mat, this helps a little bit. It helps to go faster if you happen to have a rotating mat. I do the same, but now I'm lining up the ruler with the cut edges, making sure it's the cut edges there. And on the bottom that I've already trimmed, now I just simply trim off the side and the top. There you have it. You'll want to do the same thing for all 36 blocks, and then it'll be time to add the sashing and the sashing posts. So here is a photo of the completed quilt top up on my makeshift design wall in my kitchen. This way you can see the quilt layout. You'll notice that it has sashing between the blocks and the rows, along with the sashing posts, and it has borders around all 4 sides. The layout is an alternating layout. The quilt layout alternates 16 patch blocks with HST blocks. You may remember we have 6 different designs of HST blocks. I put each of those designs in its own row. I'm going to pop up the illustration from the pattern itself to show you what I mean. So row 1, 3, and 5 will start with the 16 patch block, while rows 2, 4, and 6 will start with the block for that row. One tip that I suggest is that you lay out the whole quilt, get the blocks where you want them, and then stack them up in rows or columns. I prefer rows because that's how my brain works. That way I can chain piece adding the sashing strips to each block and then to each row, and put each row up on my design board as I go. Another tip is to take a photo of your desired layout of the quilt before you begin stacking them into rows or columns. That way you can refer back to it at any time because it's awfully easy to get them mixed up or turned around. You'll have the photo quick and easy at hand. I use my iPad for this. It works great. Here are rows 1 through 4 up on my makeshift design wall. And here is my layout for rows 5 and 6, continuing the alternation of the 16 patch and the HST block. In designing this quilt, I had 3 reasons for putting sashing between the blocks. 1 is to differentiate between the blocks. 2 is to give your eye a place to rest. And 3, that way you will not have to match up seams between the blocks. That makes it more beginner friendly. Let me explain how we're going to add the sashing to the blocks and the rows. In my case, I'm not doing it the traditional way to add sashing. I find this way, which I found from the Gourmet Quilter at gourmetquilter.com. She has a wonderful video. This way makes more sense and for me is more accurate. The traditional way is to add your sashing to the blocks and make each row block, sashing, and so on. And then you would also make the row sashing, sashing post, sashing, sashing post in one long strip. So you would have one long row of blocks and one long row of sashing, row sashing and posts. What I find is it's difficult to match up the sashing posts. It's like moving things around. It's just frustrating. So I like her way better. The way that you do this, and what I recommend in the pattern, is first you're going to sew your sashing to your block. And the way we'll do that is like this. You line up the top edge right here, the top edge of the sashing to the top edge of the block. You're going to sew right sides together down the side, and you'll attach the sashing. Then you're going to cut off any excess. That's part 1. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my sashing post, this is the corner piece, to the edge of my sashing, right sides together. So I'll have a piece like that. And then I'm going to line up the two, lining up the sashing post here with the sash here, and then sew them together, right sides together. So I'm going to do the same thing for each block individually. Now it's time to begin assembling the blocks. I will assemble each block the same way. In every case, I am choosing the right side of the block. You will sew on a sashing strip for the first 5 blocks of the 6 in the row. You ask, why don't I sew a sashing strip on the very last block, the 6th block in the row? That will be where the border strip comes along the entire length of the quilt. Then it's time to sew the sashing posts to the row sashing. I just went through and I put them in random order, only making sure that I didn't have the same 2 colors, one right after another. Here you can see I have my sashing strips stacked up and my sashing posts stacked up. All I'm going to do is take one, right sides together, stitch it on. The same thing with the next one, snugging it right up under that needle. And continue chain piecing the entire stack. As you can see here, I have my blocks for my first row stacked up and my sashing strips with sashing posts stacked up, ready to go. I'm going to join them together and I'll show you how. The first thing, you'll take a sashing strip with sashing posts, set those others aside, and you're going to want to finger press this seam going toward the sashing strip, toward the dart. in this case the sashing strip. I'll show you the reason in a moment, so I'm going to use my fingernail, or you could use the pad of your finger, and gently nudge it going that direction to the left. Then I'm going to lay it right sides together, and I'm going to nest the seams. We did not press the other one on the block. It wants to naturally go this way. Since we finger pressed this one, it will naturally go that way. So we're going to pin them right here. This is the most important one to pin. And then I'm going to pin along the sashing strip about halfway. And this excess I'll trim off in a moment. So I'm ready to stitch the two sections together. You'll notice that I'm stitching with the block itself on the top and the small sashing strip underneath. The reason for that is there are a lot of seams on the block, and I want to make sure that when I catch them, they are laid flat. So that's important. And I snug that next block right up under the needle and continue. So here is block 1. I've attached the sashing strip to the block, and then the sashing strip on the bottom with the sashing post to the block itself. So you can see up on my makeshift design wall the first 2 rows of the quilt with the sashing and sashing posts on them. When you're sewing the sashing strips on, please make sure you don't sew sashing strips to the right-hand side of the last block in each row. That's because you're going to have a border on each side of the quilt. So the borders will handle the top of row 1, the sides of block 1 and block 6, left and right respectively, and then the bottom of row 6 as well. So the border strips will take care of that. Don't do what I did and forget and sew on a sashing strip on the end of the last block and have to take it off. After you sew on your sashing strips and sashing post, you'll want to press the blocks before sewing them together. Press the seam toward the sashing strips going both ways. If your iron drips like mine did, just go over it and let it dry. And let's look at the back to see if there are any twisted seams. It's looking good. If there were twisted seams, you could clip them right at the edge, not through the seam, but just up to the seam right in the corner, and then you can press it the other direction. That will flatten out the seam. Here I have my row 1 stack of blocks. I'm going to nest the seams right here where the sashing strips meet at the corner, and then sew right sides together all the way down. I'm going to pin here at this intersection, and then at least once right here as well. Then I'll continue sewing the rest of the blocks in the row together. Here it is one more time, the Summer Scrappy Sizzler Quilt Along in the multicolor colorway. I'll have the blue and white colorway for you in a couple of weeks with a quick recap of the project. Thank you so much for sewing along with me on my Summer Scrappy Sizzler Quilt Along. Thank you for watching today's video. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up, leave me a comment, and let me know if you were sewing along with me. I sure hope so, and I'd love for you to email me a photo of your quilt. With your permission, I'd love to feature it on my blog as well. Don't forget to check out my free patterns on my website in my free patterns section, and be sure to download the Summer Scrappy Sizzler patterns and information by this August 31st, 2022. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.